Hello, this is Adam Elstein. I'm recording a brief tutorial about how to make a rendered section in Maxwell Studio. This will actually be two tutorials. The first one, I'll set up a rendering using some very basic geometry. In the second, I'll show you how to optimize the renders and create interesting output. So this tutorial is being recorded for some students of mine in the fall of 2013, Pratt Undergraduate Studio, on a city of abandoned grain silos in Buffalo, New York, called Silo City. So we'll be rendering some grain silos. Let's begin with the base file. I've created a simple silo in the 3D program and used the plugin from that program to export the silo geometry into a Maxwell Studio file. Let's come and open this up. And basically what I do is I grab the .mxs file, which I've exported. In this case, it was actually out of SketchUp, but it could have been out of Rhino. Export as a .mxs. Come to Studio, open Studio, and it seems like there was a little bit of extraneous stuff in there, so I'm just going to say no. And now we have the file geometry. One of the things that you often find when you import a file is you get all kinds of cameras and views that are not necessarily relevant to what you want to do. So the first thing I generally do is go up to my cameras and I delete any views that are unnecessary. Now by using my middle mouse button, right-clicking together with the Alt or the Option key, I can basically position and look at this tube. This is effectively a 90-foot silo. It's about 9 inches in thickness. In other words, pretty analogous to what we'll find some of the silos, individual tubes up in Buffalo. Okay, so a few other things you're going to want to clean and be able to understand. You get a bunch of materials down here in this list right on the lower right-hand corner, material 1, material 2. They're not particularly relevant, so we're going to get rid of both of them. So I just basically select them and say, remove selected. And now what happens, you see the model goes gray. It's the default color. The objects are listed right up here to the right of the main window in the object listing panel. These come in as a group. As a matter of fact, let's drill down and actually examine what is in this file. So if I open up the group, it looks like there's another group beneath it, and then there's two groups beneath, two actually objects beneath that. This happens to be how the layers were structured in the program that I used to generate this geometry. And it's not, strictly speaking, necessary at this point, so I'm actually going to grab these two and hit ungroup. Now they're out of the group, and I can actually get rid of this group geometry and delete it and remove it. So now let's just see what these things are. Well, if I select the top one, it looks like what I'm seeing is the outside of the circle, or outside of the silo. If I select the inside one, I'm seeing the inside. So let's rename them. And we'll right-click on the top one, rename as silo exterior. And then we'll grab the next one, right-click, rename as silo interior. Okay, it's good to have things that are properly named. Now the next thing I'm going to do, well the first thing I'm going to do actually is just briefly apply a material to this silo, and I'm going to try to use concrete material. I'm going to go to my material browser, and I happen to have installed some materials which come with most installations of Maxwell. Some materials which are known as Arrowway materials. I happen to like the Concrete 09, so if I come to the material browser area, I can grab Concrete 09 and I will drag it down into my materials area. And it will ask me, do I want to embed it in the scene or keep it as a reference? I'll say embed in the scene. So now it's actually in there, it's listed. And if I were to come over, I usually check things to be sure that the bitmaps and everything have transferred over properly by coming in and double-clicking, double left-clicking on the sort of rendered view here in the material editor down to the lower left-hand corner and rendering it out. And indeed, I can see that there's texture there. So this is working well. For those of you who know Maxwell, this particular material is set up to reflect real scale, which is good, and so it will most likely map pretty well, with obviously some repeat issues because this is larger than the material itself. The silo is larger than the material itself, but this will map onto the silos, and this one, for a variety of reasons, seems to work pretty well. So I'm going to apply it to both of these, both the interior and the exterior for now. You can do that simply by dragging and dropping. So right now it's on the interior. I can drag and drop it on the exterior. So now if we look up in our objects group, you'll notice that there is an interior and exterior with materials applied on both. So I'm going to come back down just to look into my perspective window. And one thing that you can do in order to sort of see the material and try to perceive the mapping. So if I come up to the viewport window, there's a drop down near the left-hand corner. It defaults to shaded. If I drop it down, I'll bring it to textured. And if I do that, I can start to actually zoom in and perceive that there is indeed texture here. Now it's sort of a funny thing, but this particular texture map does create a repetitive pattern. But in this case, it's actually a very realistic and useful repetitive pattern for us because anyone who's been up to Buffalo and seen the silos recognizes that they're built on a sort of radial structure of rebar, and you do sort of perceive these regular sort of striations in the concrete material. So the fact that I see these kind of repeat patterns for once actually works in our favor. So we're going to accept that for the moment. Next thing is let's set up a very, very basic lighting schema to understand what's going on. We're working now to produce a sort of analytical rendered section, so I'm not going to actually try to use something that would mimic the physical sky. I'm going to go, instead I'm going to use something which is known as a constant dome, and that's going to simply be there to provide a little bit of basic ambient light. So what we need to do is we need to go to our environment parameters, which is to the right. On the default layout, there's object parameters, then environment parameters. And if we go to the environment type, I'm going to set it to sky. And under sky settings, I'm going to choose constant dome. Now, what I'd like to do is to give myself the ability to have basically a black or a dark gray background. So I'm going to want to change the defaults for the colors. Let me just click on the color swatch for zenith, and I want this to be a little bit lighter than absolute black. The reason that is because constant dome will actually use the background color to sort of shine light into the scene. So I open up the color picker. I actually like to use the hue saturation value color space in order to understand how things are working. So if I just click to HSV, that allows me to change the color, saturation, and the key one for us is the value. If I slide value out a little bit, you'll notice that it becomes a bit grayer. It's not totally black, so let's slide it to somewhere around 40 or something like that. Say OK. Now that gives me a gray color swatch in the zenith. If I look over here on the right, I select that, drag it to horizon. So just right-click on it or left-click on it and drag it. I now have effectively a sort of a constant dome with the same color as the horizon and the zenith. I can leave the intensity. It's going to sort of default at 10,000. Actually, let's bring the intensity down to something more like, let's call it 300, which is candelas per meter, something like that. I want to say, how is this all going to work? How can we check the lighting? Well, Maxwell has a very fast interactive render preview, which is called Fire. And we can quickly just come and press the Fire button. And when we do that, we see something, although it's not very clear. So the question is, how can we sort of optimize the view? Well, what we need to do is we need to actually create a camera, a physical camera, and use that as we would a regular camera to optimize the exposure. That will also help us to set up our scene, our view, and our perspective. We do that in the camera area to the left in Maxwell Studio. If I right-click, I'll say New Camera, and I'll double-click on that new camera to make it active. When I do that, you'll notice that I suddenly see a little yellow line and a viewport in, or rather a sort of a tighter crop in my viewport. The presence of this little yellow line and a tighter crop means that I'm looking through the camera. So what we can do actually now, as a matter of fact, there's a drop down here where you can see what you're looking through. I can go to my general perspective view, or I can go to camera view. And I can rename this camera. Let's rename it. We'll call it My Shot, just so we know what it is. So that's My Shot. I usually make another camera as well, which maybe I'll rename it Fly Around. I like to have one camera which is kind of a scratch camera that doesn't really matter, and one which is the actual shot. So we're going to talk it through in a moment. Let's double click on My Shot for the moment, and let's actually change the exposure parameters to start giving us something that's more or less reasonable. In order to do that, I have to select the camera in the camera list and then come to camera parameters. And there's a bunch of different parameters that you can control. This is where I think the power of the studio really lies for me personally. The first thing that you want to choose is, or set up, is the exposure. The best way to do that is to come down to this factor which is known as EV. First of all, set your f-stop to something that will give you a lot of depth of field. Let's say 22. There's no diffraction in Maxwell unless you enable it, so we'll set this to a fairly narrow f-stop, which will give us a good depth of field. You notice when I did that, the fire window went black. That's because the exposure, and if I was stopping down on a camera, there's no light getting in. So the next thing I'm going to want to do is come to the EV number. I think this is the best way to control things. And rotate. And bring the EV number down to something like 9. For anyone who's ever studied photography, understands the zone system. This is just a kind of quantum of light, the EV, in this case a quantum of virtual light. So we're going to give this a general exposure of about 9. You can play with it. The lower it goes, lighter it gets. Use 8. Let's just use 9 for the time being. We're going to play with this this later. The other thing I'll probably going to want to do is I'm going to change my focal length from a 35mm lens to a 50, because I think that's a good natural perspective. And I'm going to change my output. Well, I'm not going to change my output resolution for the moment, but right down here you can see where you would change your output resolution. I'll just go ahead and change it. Why not? Let's suppose I want to render this at 1800 pixels wide, which is 1350 tall. That's actually a pretty high-res image. You could actually get away with maybe 1280 by 960. That would be reasonable. Maybe 1400. For full HD. Depends whether you're primarily displaying your image on the screen or you're interested in printing it. Suppose I was interested in printing it, but I need a trade-off. I need something that I can potentially up-res in Photoshop later. Let's call it 1800. We'll leave everything else the case here. We'll leave this set at ISO 100, which is the film sensitivity. And that's all good. So now at least we come in here, we can actually see something, and we're getting a very, very flat render, which is fine for the moment. Now, the next thing we want to do is, if I zoom out, by the way, if I'm on My Shot, you'll see other cameras. This is basically the fly-around camera. If I double-click on the fly-around camera and I zoom out, you'll see the view from the My Shot camera. Now, what I want to do is I want to set up an orthographic view. What does an orthographic view mean? Or let's call it not necessarily orthographic perfectly, because I'm going to leave this with some perspectival distortion. But I do want to be basically oblique to the silo, and I want to be shooting down one particular axis. So how can I set that camera view up? Well, one of the nice things about Maxwell is that you can, in Maxwell Studio, is you have independent control over both the camera position and the target position. So let me click on my shot. Now I'm not going to double click, I'm just going to single click because that allows me to still look through the fly around window but be looking at the My Shot camera. And what I happen to know is if I come to My Shot camera, I'm going to change certain things. I'm going to change the camera's position. I'm going to change this to 90. And I'm going to change the target to 0. And I'm going to change the Z to 0 and also to 0. And then finally what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the Y height to 12 and 12. Now let me explain what I'm doing here. First of all, look at where the camera is. It's now facing pretty much obliquely to the silo. And you can see the shot, this little yellow lines are sometimes referred to as the camera frustum. You can see how the shot lines up nicely and basically frames the silo perfectly obliquely. Let me just explain quickly what these parameters are for. In Maxwell, like many programs, it's a Y up world. So by controlling the Y parameter, both in terms of the camera height and actually the target, I'm controlling how high the camera is off the ground and where the camera is pointing. So Maxwell's units are in meters. As a result, this suggests that I'm basically about 12 meters off the ground, or about roughly halfway in this, well, actually really more, I suppose, a third of the way, a little more than a third of the way up this 90-foot high silo. It's going to give me a reasonable perspective. I might even say I want to be 15 feet up, 15 meters, excuse me. Now the fact that I set the target and the camera at the same height means that I'm not tilting up or tilting down. What that means is very important for architectural rendering. That means that I'm not introducing any 3-point perspective. That's how I produce a perfect 2-point perspective. So now we can see where the camera is. Let's actually click on it, double click on My Shot and see what the view is. Let's double click on that. And we'll see now we have effectively a perfect oblique elevation. As I say, not orthographic because there is a little bit of perspective in here. I am using a real lens, a 50mm lens. But I am oblique to this, so this is a good elevation shot from about midway through the silo. So this is going to give us the ability to do some interesting renders. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to want to do is let's put a light in the silo. Let's go and put actually just a long, narrow tube. This is just going to be kind of an indicative light. But we want something that's going to put some light inside the tube. We can experiment with all kinds of different lights. Let's put a long, narrow tube in first of all. Let's go to File, Library, Objects, Primitives, Tube, Import. It says Import. I'll do that. I'm going to close down Fire for the moment. So when I do that, suddenly there is a tube in the scene. Now I don't see it because it's behind the silo. One of the things that I might do for the moment is actually come to change the viewport to wireframe. And if I do that, it's a little bit easier. I'm going to go to my fly around camera because I don't want to mess up my shot. By the way, when you have a shot, if you don't want to mess it up, and it's very easy to mess it up accidentally, I highly recommend that you actually click the locked button. Okay, so now that camera cannot be messed up. So I'm going to go back to my fly around window, and this is all good. You'll notice if I come here, you can see a little teeny tiny cylinder. Oh, actually I made it a tube, and I think a tube is excessive geometry, so I'm going to remove that. I'm actually going to just simply make a cylinder. So go to File, Library, Objects, Primitives, Cylinder. There we go. Okay, now this comes in, and it's a cylinder. I'm going to use this to become a light by applying a material that will emit virtual light, a so-called emitter material. But the first thing I'm going to want to do is make this smaller we'll make this longer and narrower, as if it was a massive fluorescent bulb. And it's not going to have a lot of detail, but it'll just serve some sort of indicative purpose. So I'm going to grab the cylinder, and I'm going to come up here to hit the scale button. And I'm going to actually, first of all, I'm going to scale this guy down so that it's very, very narrow. I'm just going to eyeball this. And the next thing I'm going to do is actually grab just the green and scale it up a lot. Oops. And somehow, occasionally you will have these issues where you won't be able to grab a handle, but you'll just work with it. So let's put it there. It's good enough, for government work, as they say. So once I have that in there, I'll click away. I'm just going to click to this little cross button, which is actually the move button. And I'm going to actually try to move this thing so that it's sort of floating in the middle of the silo, somewhere about there-ish. Okay. So now let's actually try to go back to my shot camera. And we'll see where it is. Oh, also sometimes if you have other cameras that are annoying, they can be hidden, so I'm going to turn off the frustum of the hidden camera. And if I hit I can get rid of some of this extraneous detail, which I'll explain to you in a while. So I can just basically come in here and position that light as we like it. Let's just put it there, the tube, the cylinder as we like it. Okay, so there we go. So now if I wanted to quickly check this, first of all I would come back, maybe turn on the texture view. Of course you don't see anything because the cylinder's inside the silo. And I could also quickly hit fire. We won't see anything. But if we were to come back to this fire on camera again, though I don't see the frustum, I can perceive what's there. You'll notice that there's that little tube in there. And if I quickly render it, now one of the things, of course, is fly around doesn't have a good exposure. So I would come quickly over to fly arounds and also take its EV number down so that I can see what's happening. Okay, so there's something in there. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to use that as a lighting proxy, just to see what it might be like to have this long, narrow fluorescent tube in the center of the silo. This is just something to indicate how to apply an emissive material. I'm not saying it's the best way to light this. Okay, so close. So the next thing we were going to do, we had went to the material editor to create, to bring in a pre-made material. The next thing we're going to do is actually make an emissive material. And to do that, we are going to go to a material list and right-click, and we'll drop down and accept the option for new emitter. And a new emitter will be created. Maxwell applies materials with the ability to emit light, and that's how all emitters are created, geometry with an applied material. When the material comes in, if we were to, let's say, take this material and put it onto the cylinder, and we were to basically try to render it, you would notice it doesn't seem to have any behavior at all. That's because the actual material, when it comes in, is configured to be a 40-watt light bulb. And if you imagine stretching the power of a 40-watt light bulb over this probably impossibly high, 90-foot high fluorescent tube, it would be pretty dim. So we're going to change the luminance model of the material to let's take it to luminance, which is candelas per meter. And I'm going to change the output here to something actually quite high, like maybe 50,000. 2, 3. Just in order to get this peculiar light type working. So now if I were to come in and hit fire again, well, first of all, you'll see suddenly there's a lot of light in the scene, probably overexposed. So I can bring this down. Actually, let's try to bring this until I can see something that is a little bit more reasonable. Let's say 10,000. 1, 2, 3. All right, so now we're reading a light in there. It's not completely sort of blowing things out. We can change the power in this output parameter, and that can be useful later, sort of analytically. Okay, so we have basically a situation. We have a silo with a material applied to it. We also have a light, and we have a shot. So now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to set this up for an analytical section. So what I'm going to do in this for now is I'm going to simply set up a few silos, and then on the next video I'm going to talk about how to set up the section plane and set up the lighting and the render outputs. So quickly, in order to set up a few silos here, what I would do is I would go and grab 3 silos. I would right-click and group them. Let's call this silo A. Now they're in a group. And what I would probably do at this point is actually right-click and clone the silo, and that's basically a copy operation. And I would take the clone and I would move it. Oh, that seems to work very well. I would move it to the right. We're just going to eyeball this to kind of present as sort of an elevation. Let's do 1. Let's go back to this silo again, clone it. I'm doing this because I want to start with the kind of base silo from the base position. Oops, again, did something strange. Grab that blue handle. Clone one to the right here. Now, I'm not even really checking precisely the distance. I could be doing that, or I'm expecting that people probably will be using a model. But I just want to produce a few silo geometries for our render. Let's do maybe 2 more. Clone. Again, seems to be a pattern. Let's bring this one over. Bring it like that. And maybe the last one. Clone. See if I can do it without my little move. Oh, yeah, I think it must be a bug. Grab it in. There we go. So that actually also sort of works with my composition for a reasonable sort of analytical treatment. So it's framed. Okay, so here we go. If I were to quickly hit my fire button, you'll see you have your basic silo configuration with no shadows, no nothing, and this is where we're going to start in the next video. So I'm going to stop this for the moment, and we'll start in a second. Start again in a moment.